This morning's programme will begin with a few words from our Mayor, Councillor Pamela Kearns, and following that we will hear from Lorcan Blake of Grant Thornton, and we will conclude with a panel discussion focusing on the City Edge project. So on behalf of everyone here in SDCC, thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoyed the event and the discussion is both engaging and informative. So I'll hand you over to our Mayor, Councillor Pamela Kearns.
That's where you clap them. Now, if you're in charge of our economic department, I'm really upset because that is not an economical speech, despite Laura's best efforts. However, I shall endeavour to do my best. I will not be saying, the Dublin Economic Monitor each time. It'll be the Monitor, because I think after I say it once, everybody will know what I'm talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, elected members, colleagues and members of our community, welcome to this year's annual launch of the Dublin Economic Monitor. The Monitor is a quarterly report and a data resource that tracks the performance of Dublin's economy. There's an online website, but also there's a new podcast where you can listen to updates on national and on the Dublin economies. The past 12 months have shown how Dublin's economy is resilient in the face of mounting global uncertainty. Business activity has remained strong and robust, and consumer spending continues to be a key support for the county's economy. Just a few months ago, we launched our own economic strategy here in South Dublin, and at its heart is a clear and ambitious plan to create 1,500 new jobs per year. We are building on a strong foundation. Today, South Dublin supports an economy worth over 22 billion, but we are not standing still. Over the next decade, our ambition is to grow to more than 28 billion through smart planning, targeted investment and development that aligns with national and regional priorities. We are progressing major regeneration projects, including Clonburris SDZ and Adams SEZ, where almost 19,000 homes are planned, and with many already delivered. These are not just housing developments, that they are foundations of new communities, and I've been out there and they are communities. They're not just homes thrown up. It's amazing out there. In Tallaght Innovation Quarter, you can see that vision in action. Earlier this year, over 130 cost rental homes were delivered right here alongside this building, which I think you will agree is a fabulous building. Work IQ, where we are today. Work IQ is a home to many startups and has created over 200 jobs since opening in 2024. We will be welcoming a panel of experts today to discuss the City Edge project, which is one of the largest regeneration initiatives in Europe and which aims to deliver over 13 billion to the economy annually on completion. And when I got onto the council originally in 2009, I was brought on a tour. This was proposed because of various things that have happened in our economy over the years. But the planning that went into it, it's now coming to fruition. So it goes to show careful planning will work. With continued collaboration with all the other local authorities, we are confident that we can realise this vision, ensuring that Dublin remains a place of opportunity, ambition and progress now into the future. I would like to thank you all for coming here today and to welcome Lorcan Blake, economist with Grant Thornton, to come up and share his insights on the current position of the global, national and the Dublin economies. Thank you very much.
I can disconnect this so that everybody can see the screen behind me. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lorcan Blake. We in Grant Thornton are delighted to be involved in the Dublin Economic Monitor alongside our partners in Pearl and Dean. And we've been working on the Monitor over the last number of years, and we feel it remains a really important publication in terms of the hard copy, but also the website, which the Mayor mentioned, our podcast, our video. It's a really rich resource in terms of understanding the capital's economy, bringing together real-time indicators on everything from the labour market to the housing market to retail spending to the Purchasing Managers Index, some of which I'll touch on today. I will bring you through three different areas in particular. I'll just move along the slides. So, as the Mayor mentioned, I'll touch on the global context. We have obviously seen a huge amount of volatility in the last 3 or 4 months, which could not have been foreseen at the start of the year. Hold on, this is a little bit fiddly, so I've been warned to pause each slide. There we go. We have seen massive volatility in the last 3 or 4 months, which could not have been foreseen at the start of this year. That has had a major impact on Dublin's economy and indeed on the Irish economy as a whole. Overall, the story we're seeing is one of continued resilience, but with rising volatility and emerging pressure points in various parts of our economy. Dublin remains a strong performing city by international standards, which I think is really important to understand. But the data suggests that the economic cycle is beginning to shift somewhat, particularly in terms of inflation, which every consumer and business in Ireland will be well aware of at the present time, but also in terms of labour market conditions and indeed consumer sentiment. So, each quarter we start with the Global Uncertainty Index. This isn't by any means a scientific data set. It essentially tracks how frequently the phrase uncertainty is used within the news cycle. As you can see, in the past 10, 15 years, we've had notable peaks around, say, the Great Financial Crisis, Brexit, trade tensions related to Brexit, the war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis. But what we've seen in the last 12 months in particular, starting with the imposition of trade barriers and tariffs in the US and in other states around the world, and following that in the Middle East is really unprecedented. So what we're seeing is uncertainty that is now comparable to many previous major global shocks, and it is certainly feeding through directly into economic decision making. Trade disruptions are ongoing, and this is a topic which I'll come back to in just a moment. The Strait of Hormuz is a place that many people wouldn't have known of 6 or 12 months ago, but it's top of everybody's mind at the present time. It's in the news cycle constantly, and everybody seems to be tracking what's going on there at the present time. So on the left-hand side here, you can see vessels that are going in and out of the Strait of Hormuz on a daily basis. Numbers are still way down compared to where they were in January or February of this year. They're down about 60% at the present time, and that has real knock-on effects when you think about energy, supply chains, trade, and so forth. On the right-hand side, you can see commercial flights in and out of 9 major international airports in the Middle East, so the likes of Doha, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and so forth. They are way down as well, and that has a real impact in many different areas, and some of them relate directly to Dublin. When you think about our supply chains for multinational companies, energy, obviously, when oil is coming in and out of the Strait of Hormuz, trade flows and tourism, indeed. When you think about the right-hand side, 1 in 6 global passengers who's jumping onto a connecting flight goes through a Middle Eastern airport. So that has a real knock-on effect in terms of tourism when you think of people coming to Ireland, but also people travelling around the world from Irish airports. On the side of commodity prices, here we have a chart from the OECD, which shows the change in different commodity prices between February of this year and May of this year. So quite a small period of time, but there's been a massive impact. So the dark blue bars are energy related. So the likes of gas, Brent, crude oil, coal, they have all increased by double-digit percentages. And this has a real knock-on effect when you think about energy prices for consumers and for businesses in the likes of Asia, in the Middle East, but also closer to home, in Europe, in Ireland, and in Dublin in particular. The OECD has also produced projections as to what's going to happen to global growth in 2026 and into 2027. So in 2025, global growth is about 3.5%, which is a reasonably strong rate of growth. But in 2026, that will definitely fall back. It's just a question of how far that will fall back by. In terms of a time-limited disruption scenario, so that's peace in the Middle East, things starting to unfold from July onwards. Growth is expected to be about 2.8% this year, rising to about 3% next year. In a situation where there's a prolonged disruption into 2027 and beyond, global growth is expected to slow down even further, so to about 2% this year and even lower next year. So again, that has real implications. Ireland is an exposed economy. We are an open economy, but these growth scenarios really show that growth could materially weaken over the next 2 years. On this chart, the colours aren't quite as I'd anticipated they'd show up on the screen, but in essence what I'd like to point out is that the red line is the 2% rate that the ECB typically targets in terms of inflation for the Eurozone at any moment in time. A couple of key points to mention here. First of all, the line that you see dipping very low on the chart are energy prices. So over the past 2 years, energy prices were actually falling in many cases, and that was a real positive in terms of businesses and consumers. Things were coming back a little bit from the heights of the likes of the start of the war in Ukraine and so forth, which really had massive disruptive side effects for many people. However, you can see the line has jumped up in the past 2 or 3 months, and that is the result of the Middle Eastern conflict, where energy prices are now rising by over 10% year on year across the Eurozone. And that has ultimately resulted in this other faint line, but you can just about see above the red line. That's the overall inflation rate. So it's above 2% at the present time. It's actually at about 3%. And the upshot of that is that we are expecting the ECB to increase interest rates. Indeed, they're meeting today and tomorrow, and the anticipation is that interest rates will increase, as I'll touch on in just a moment. So again, that'll have knock-on effects in terms of consumer confidence, in terms of mortgage holders, in terms of businesses' ability to lend and repay loans and so forth. So real-time impacts are likely to be felt in the coming months on that side. And that, again, that all ties back to the energy crisis, the war in the Middle East, and so on. With regards to those interest rates, this chart shows the European Central Bank's deposit interest rate. So this is one of their main interest rates that's applied. About 2 years ago, 3 years ago, this was at about 4%, but it came down quite rapidly, which is really positive again in terms of monetary loosening and borrowers being able to access loans at far lower rates. The anticipation is, as I mentioned, that the dotted blue line will see an increase in interest rates this year, and maybe even 2 increases. So we're currently at a deposit interest rate of 2%. The expectation is that that'll increase to about 2.5% over the course of this year. Beyond that, it's exceptionally hard to tell exactly what will happen, but there may be cuts to come in, say, 2027, but so much of this depends on that disruption I mentioned earlier on the inflation rate overall, and you would hope that there will be some light at the end of the tunnel on that front. Turning to Ireland's economy, the key message here is that we are at risk, we are exposed, but the outlook remains broadly positive. So Ireland really is quite a resilient economy in many ways. We do have exposures in certain areas, though, as we have demonstrated on the slide here. So the likes of energy prices, and particularly fossil fuels. Ireland is exposed there. Renewables maybe haven't come on stream as quickly as we would have liked in Ireland. A second thing I'd mention are those global supply chains. We have so many multinationals in Ireland. So many of them are within global supply chains that any disruption can have a pretty significant impact. And then finally, I think it would be remiss to make any presentation in this day and age without mentioning AI and the potential impact of AI with regards to employment within specific sectors, but also the growth of new sectors. AI, data centres, and digital infrastructure are all top of mind. And as I will touch on in a moment, we are seeing foreign direct investment into areas such as those. So there are mixed messages in terms of what AI might do for the workforce now and into the future. With regards to growth rates, the European Commission is actually quite positive on Ireland. Domestic growth remains quite solid. So domestic demand was about 5% in 2025. The expectation is that that'll fall back to about 2 or 3% this year. So still in positive territory, especially when you consider all that's going on globally. Inflation is expected to increase. So it was at about 2% last year in Ireland. So that's around the rate you'd be expecting and what the ECB is targeting overall for the Eurozone. That's expected to jump up to about 3.5% this year. So that'll definitely have a knock-on effect for many people. I think the Commission summed it up quite well here in saying that growth in domestically driven demand in Ireland is expected to continue. However, the energy price shock is expected to push inflation higher, weighing on real income and growth. So that's literally the money you have in your pocket at any given moment in time. The outlook for public finances is positive, but more marked by significant risks to corporate tax revenue. And that's a drum that's been beaten repeatedly in recent years, and I think has to be brought up quite frequently because we do have a huge dependency on corporate tax revenues, and that does leave us a little bit exposed to those global geopolitical changes which I mentioned earlier on. Moving towards consumer sentiment, in the hard copy of the Monitor, we have the April 2026 consumer sentiment findings. We now have the May figures which have come out, and they're somewhat more positive. April seemed to be the real low point in terms of consumer confidence with regards to the current situation of the economy and indeed the forward-looking piece. With regards to the May figures, Consumer sentiment improved slightly, but remains weak amid cost pressures. So that's to be expected given the real blunt impact of the war in the Middle East. Secondly, quite notably, 1 in 4 Irish households reported to the Irish League of Credit Unions that they're unable to cover a €1,000 shock, which I thought was quite a stark figure in terms of what we've seen in recent times and the potential impact of rising energy prices over the coming months. We are in many ways lucky that it's the summer period now. Winter is just around the corner, so a huge amount will hinge on energy prices when winter does come. And indeed, we saw the fuel protests in April as maybe a first flare in that regard as to what might be coming down the lines. Finally, Irish consumers overall remained quite anxious despite a slight easing in energy costs. So an improvement in the consumer sentiment outlook, but overall there are definitely challenges there, and there's underlying concerns in many quarters. Finally, moving on to Dublin. That's why we're here today. As I said, the outlook is actually quite good in terms of Dublin's economy, and resilience really is a hallmark. So what we have on screen here is called the Purchasing Managers Index. So this essentially tracks business activity in the Dublin economy every quarter. The blue line represents Dublin and the red line represents the rest of Ireland. As you can see, the blue line for Dublin was above the 50 mark. So the 50 mark essentially means whether you're in expansion or contraction. So if you're below 50, business activity is falling. So in Dublin, we had a really strong first quarter to the year. The opposite was the case in the rest of Ireland. So you could say in Q1 of this year, the Dublin economy really was the growth driver for the Irish economy. So we saw really strong growth rates across the board. The PMI reached its highest point in 4 years, which again is really positive given what's going on at the present time. 2 areas I'd mention in particular as performing really well are the likes of construction and manufacturing. So they were up near the 60 mark, so really rapid expansion in those areas. Services was a little bit softer, but still in expansion mode. So overall, a really positive story overall. New orders were also increasing, so that's what the pipeline looks like for businesses. Strong expansion there. Employment again was a little bit softer, but still in positive territory. So a really positive outlook in terms of business activity, but we will critically be tracking this in Q2 when the real impacts of the war in the Middle East are seen. So we look forward to seeing what's published in the September 2026 monitor on that front. On retail spending, this somewhat relates to the consumer sentiment figures I mentioned just a moment ago. The blue line again here represents Dublin, the red line represents Ireland. So you can see that the value of retail spending in Dublin has continued to increase. Indeed, it's been accelerating. The growth rate in Q1 of this year was almost 3% quarter on quarter and 10% year on year. So really positive. There is obviously a level of consumer confidence at play here, but there's a really important nuance to mention as well. So there's been strong growth in necessity spending. So that's like your groceries, your day-to-day basics. So there's an evident shift towards necessities and away from the likes of discretionary spending in department stores, clothing stores and so forth, and experience-based spending. So that'll be the likes of restaurants, bars, hotels and so forth. So again, that's likely a reflection of inflation and the fact that people are maybe tightening certain areas in terms of their spending and by necessity having to spend more on the likes of groceries and their daily basics in any given week. So this overall suggests that households are spending, but they are more cautious and certainly adapting their spending plans to the current environment. On the labour market, I mentioned a slight softening earlier on. So the most notable piece here was that the unemployment rate in Dublin, in the right-hand chart here, hit about 5.4% in the first quarter of this year. So that was a 4-year high and is a sign that is a little bit concerning. There certainly has been an upward trajectory in the overall unemployment rate in Dublin, and that's partly reflected in employment, which is on the left-hand side here. So that fell by just over 1% in Q1 of 2026. Certain areas grew, such as construction, but others, such as industry, saw a modest fall off in the first quarter of this year. So again, one quarter does not make a trend, but it's certainly something we want to keep a close eye on over the coming quarters. In the middle, we have job postings data from Indeed. Indeed have been great in providing us with really rich data sources in terms of what's happening with job listings on their website. The blue line again shows Dublin, and as you can see, for several years now, it's been tracking below the Irish level. So this essentially shows that there's fewer job postings in Dublin relative to the rest of the country, and there's weaker hiring demand overall. And there's certain areas that I call out there, the likes of technology and professional services, perhaps linking back to what I mentioned on AI earlier on, they've seen definite softness in recent times. So what I'd say overall is that the labour market remains strong by historical standards. You think of 16% unemployment rates in the great financial crash. The direction of travel, however, is downward despite that ongoing resilience in the Dublin labour market. I think any presentation in Ireland in this day and age wouldn't be complete without touching on the housing market. Just to mention two areas here for Dublin properties. First of all, affordability remains the key challenge for the Dublin economy. Rents continue to increase apace and are at peak levels, and the same applies with the residential prices on the left-hand side here. So you can see that there has been a moderation in the most recent months in the rate of growth in prices in Dublin, but they still remain pretty much at peak level, even compared to the Celtic Tiger years. So that's a real challenge with the prices remaining elevated, and even though there is a softening of growth, it's definitely a challenge for so many people in Dublin at the present time. On the right-hand side, the pipeline is strengthening, and that's the positive. So the blue line is the one that I would draw your attention to in particular. That's the number of completions in Dublin each quarter. The broad direction of travel is upward. So about 3,000 units were completed in Dublin in the first quarter of the year, and that was up about 30% year on year. So they're literally houses that are ready to move into, and that can be part of the stock from the day they connect essentially to the electricity grid. So really positive in that regard. It is going in the right direction. However, the red line and others show the volatility that's at play here. I won't go into the specifics of why you have such peaks and troughs, but it's safe to say that volatility is likely to continue over the coming quarters. But as I said, the direction of travel is positive, and we will expect that to feed through over maybe the medium to longer term in terms of greater affordability as you look at greater supply hitting the market. FDI, it was actually quite a positive start to 2026 again in this space. Dublin had a strong quarter, and this was a really positive outcome which we could not have foreseen. I think it's important to say that this is somewhat driven by the likes of digital technology and data centre investments, which I mentioned previously. But that this was an overall a quarter of rebounding activity in FDI. So average project size increased significantly in Dublin, and the city remains one of the leading places in Europe for FDI per capita. So that's the red bar in the chart here. That's how much is invested per quarter per person in Dublin. And as you can see, it's far in excess of the likes of London, Lisbon, Madrid, Amsterdam and Paris. So overall, a very positive picture there. But again, given our exposure to global markets and the uncertainties I mentioned earlier on, there's no guarantee that will last, but it does point towards our overall global competitiveness and attractiveness as a place to invest. Finally, to touch on the commercial property market in Dublin, CBRE have provided us with this information, and it does show, first of all, the impact of working from home and a slower return to office mandates than may have been expected at certain times in the last couple of years. What you can see in the right-hand indicators are vacancy rates. So vacancy in Dublin 2 and 4 is about 15%, which is at the upper end of what we've seen over the last 10 years. And the same applies with the Dublin suburbs, where about a 16% vacancy rate applied in Q1 of this year. So that is a challenge for many office owners and for office spaces in general across Dublin. But what's notable on the left-hand side is that city centre office rents are close to peak levels. So even there is vacancy across Dublin, this would suggest that in the city centre and in core areas across the 4 Dublin local authorities, demand is quite strong. It's in areas outside of those core areas and the central business district that there appears to be a challenge in terms of vacancy, and particularly improving the quality of stock that's available and so forth, and ensuring that there is strong demand across all of Dublin's economy. So to wrap up from my side, there's a few key takeaways for everybody here today. First of all, global volatility is back, unfortunately. We thought following the upheaval of 2021 and 2022 that we were maybe entering a period of stability. That absolutely isn't the case, unfortunately. With tariffs, with the Middle Eastern conflict, there's huge uncertainty again, which we're not sure how it's going to play out. Ireland remains resilient, but growth is slowing overall. Dublin is outperforming, certainly in a domestic context, and as I've shown, in an international context to an extent as well. And the final two things I'd say is that the consumer is under pressure. Things are becoming more expensive, consumers are becoming more defensive, but spending is holding up at the present time, but is one we definitely want to keep an eye on over the coming quarters. And then finally, structural challenges, as I've touched on, the likes of housing is top of everybody's mind, but also the likes of infrastructure and labour supply will definitely define the medium-term outlook for Dublin's economy. That's it for me. Really appreciate your attention and your attendance today. And I will pass over to Dr. Lollie Mancey, who will introduce the panel speakers today.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. For those of you that aren't familiar with my work, I'm an anthropologist, which means I've studied for the last 20 years the cultural changing landscape of Ireland. And then 4 years ago, after a decade in UCD as Programme Director in the Innovation Academy, I was discovered by RTE and now make a show called Futureville, which looks at Ireland 2050. So how do we make a research show that's based on showcasing the best of Irish research and innovation? We speak to the people about what they want. And of course, this is a challenge because what do we want and lean into for 2050 has to come from us rather than to be mandated by other people. So we got a really good sense of sort of a litmus test of how people feel. So in Science Week of 2024, which is in November, the show came out and we're now currently researching the third series for this November. And what we found by going to the people of Ireland to say, what are your hopes, dreams and fears for 2050? Well, the very same things that I think my ancestors would have said, which would be an equitable future, access to housing, health, education, and community, community, community. We feel dislocated. We want more support. We want to be more connected. Now, adding into that the potential of a loneliness epidemic that we hear about a lot of the time, what people are really seeking in how we build Ireland out is this idea of equity and community belonging. A lot of people reference the way we used to be, perhaps not only in a romanticized vision, but the fear of perhaps through generative AI and other things, other forces that are coming, that actually we may be more separate than ever before. So as we built out Futureville, which is a conceptual place, but it just so happened to be looked at and based in Athlone, what we realized was that we are going to need not only cities on the edge and the coastal regions of Ireland, but we're going to need inland cities. By 2050, we're potentially going to have 7 million people. Where will they go? How will they live? What will that look like? That's the work that we're all involved in and all take a part in at the moment. The thing that does concern me, though, is this wonderful thing that we have in Ireland, which is a meh attitude, which is, sure, but. And the sure, but means that no matter what we create in terms of innovation and the incredible opportunities that we are building, the amplification is only of the, I would hear it every day, the bike sheds, the children's hospital, yada, yada, yada. So how do we amplify the amazing things that are going on, the amazing opportunities? That's part of it. How do we offset the negative amplification and start to build that out? And that really was what Futureville was about. How do we showcase the best of Irish innovation? And now we're looking at European and global innovation this year in this series. I actually fly off to Cologne tomorrow, which is very exciting to go to the Space Centre. How do we build out the best of Europe in Ireland now for that equitable future? How do we offset some of the fears and indeed accept them and lean into the naysayers for the way that we think things are going? Part of the challenge, of course, and I am also working as an AI ethicist at the moment, is that we need to look at the impact of the fear and the cultural lag. In sociology and anthropology, what we have is a technological impact, and then we have a cultural impact that takes longer to assimilate. So we feel that we have this technology, we don't really understand it, we were fearing about it. The very same people that are leaning into AI literacy at work and understanding how to make their processes better are the very same people going home to their partners and families to say, I think I'm going to be replaced. This is a very palpable fear for us. And so I think we're in for a period of cultural disruption over the next 5 or 6 years, and to how we roll all of this out. I also think we're about to start to see some of the backlash to generative AI, and I think that's understandable. But for my sustainability students in UCD, they say, I don't want to use AI, and I'm like, well, then you better put your phone in the bin because you've been using it all of this time. The challenges are, where does it exist? How does it impact me? What does it look like? And the idea of not having agency. And so for somebody like myself, looking at the cultural change, the agency part is really important. Do I feel I have a say in the future that we're building? So I think we have challenges here. I think part of that challenge is the cultural lag of we haven't caught up to what we feel is an overwhelming amount of change and continuous change from what we've just heard in that data. How do we deal with that fear? How would we deal with the fact that there is an uncertain future? Certainly for Gen Z and Gen Alpha, the ones coming up behind them as digital natives, their fear is very real. The idea that they may not have housing, they may not have jobs, they don't know what that looks like. And that fear is feeding back to us. So as we build Futureville of this year, what we're doing is trying to read the people, to say, what does that future look like? Rather than us saying, here's a beautiful, shiny vision of a science fiction city. What does it actually look like to live there? What does it feel like to live there? Are we connected to each other? Because I can tell you that our whole reason of being, and the only reason that we have succeeded as human beings, is our social connection. It's the one thing that you will see in the blue zones, those places where people live a long and equitable and happy life. They are socially connected. So this is the fear that's undermarking, I think, a lot of the change. And as we build out to showcase innovation, what we don't want to do is to say we have all of the answers. Part of the challenge at the moment is there are few experts in the room. And in fact, generative AI is coming in as a very strong expert, around the IQ points of about 150 at the moment, about equivalent to Einstein. So as we build out a relationship, and it is a relationship we're going to have with this technology, it is more of a cognitive revolution. I am also the very same person who outed myself on the Tommy Tiernan show in January as having an AI boyfriend, which is a whole conversation for another time. But actually, we are in a relationship with this technology, whether we acknowledge it or not. The one that we're dealing with at work is very different. It's about processes. But about 80% of us are using ChatGPT for therapy and guidance. Now, that's going to affect everything in terms of how everything gets rolled out. People are using it as comparison sites. People are saying, give me an idea about what's going on with housing in Dublin. People are using it in a whole nother way that we hadn't expected. And that'll be part of what keeps me in research for the next 20 years, how this actually impacts us and how it gets rolled out. So I have an amazing panel to introduce you to at the moment. I'll let each person introduce themselves as they come up. But what we're going to do is have a look at what's going on at the moment in terms of some of the positives that we can amplify about the issues that people are most fearful of. I think the meh mentality that we have here in Ireland is the one thing that holds us back from leaning into more innovation, but also potentially we have to acknowledge that people have to come on board with these things, and that's not always easy. In the most innovative companies in the world, the devil's advocate is the most important position, the one that challenges. So we mustn't be afraid of challenge, but at the same time also we have to understand that as things change and as people adapt with this technology and as we move forward into more uncertainty, we have to accept that that's just okay. And we have to not whitewash it and move over it and say, sure, everything's going to be grand, as we always do. So I think at the moment we're in for a very interesting decade. What I will say is that we have so many incredible examples of positivity within Ireland, not only in innovation and in the work that we're doing both academically and private and public sector, but actually what we can lean into. The government are just about to announce a national AI literacy programme. Rethink Ireland are putting 1.75 million euros into AI for social good for the not-for-profit sector. We're starting to talk about digital sovereignty. There are so many discussions now that we're going to need to have about how Ireland progresses and what it looks like. But the idea that we have a say in that is really ultimately very important, even if we're bringing people on board that disagree with us. And that polarity can only grow if we don't hear all the voices. So as an anthropologist, let's realize that this is a period of extreme cultural change, but we have so much possibility for getting it right. So I'm going to let my panel come up now and introduce themselves, and thank you. Absolutely. If you'd like to all just introduce yourselves one by one as we go down the line.
You're looking at me, so I guess you're thinking I'm going to
start
start, so I
with you
will,
first.
yeah. Good morning, everyone. So I am Pete Lunn. I am a behavioural economics professor and the head of the behavioural research unit at the ESRI.
Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Andrew Archer. I'm a director of SISTRA, and I'm a transport planner.
Morning, everybody. My name is Eoin Burke. I'm the Director of Planning and Transport with South Dublin County Council.
You are. Thank you very much. Peter, I might start with you if that's all right. Is it Pete or Peter?
Pete.
Pete, sorry, apologies. Look, I mean, you just heard me talk about sort of some of the challenges that we've got at the moment in terms of public support. And I know that you do enormous research in this area. How do we encourage public support when we're developing a new city like the City Edge project?
With difficulty,
I know.
is the answer. And anybody, I mean, I'm not a planner. I have no expertise in roads and transport and housing and planning. What I study is people, and increasingly we study how people respond to change. And I can tell you very briefly about a really simple experiment we did for the National Transport Authority recently. We showed a representative sample of the Irish public, a description of an Irish town after an active travel scheme has gone in. Overwhelmingly, they support it, think it sounds like a really good town. Fewer than 10% say they don't like what it looks like, right? We then showed exactly the same description, exactly the same, to another representative sample, where the only difference was that we said that the town that they were reading about was planned. It didn't exist already, it was a plan. And suddenly opposition to the exact same town ends up rising to more than a quarter of the population instead of less than 10%. Human beings have an instinctive response to change, which is to ask the question, and I wouldn't put it quite like you did as mayor. They ask the question, what could go wrong?
Yeah.
If someone is pushing change at me, what could go wrong? And they immediately look for the negatives. And part of the reason they do this is because they can see the negatives. They can see what's being taken away from them, or what's not there that they use now. And they often can't see the positives.
Yeah.
So one final quick example before you move on. Where congestion charges have been introduced, in multiple European cities, the surveys always show that they're unpopular as policies until they exist. And once there's a congestion charge in a city, it becomes popular. London's the perfect example. The same electorate who opposed it before it was brought in voted to increase it 10 years later. Right, because they then see the effect that it has and how much it improves their city. But what they see to start with is I'm being charged for something I'm not currently being charged for. This is a change I don't like, and therefore they're inclined to oppose it. And it's only when they see the massive benefits that it produces for their city a few years later they go, maybe I got that one wrong, and I'll quietly now tell the surveyor I support it. So change is really hard for people, and that's one of the reasons why.
It's such an interesting paradox, isn't it? Because change is the only certainty, and the continual change is actually a reality. Is it the pace of change at the moment that's such a challenge, in your opinion, in terms of behavioural change? People feel to me very overwhelmed.
Yes, so part of the problem, part of the reason people are scared of change, they go straight for the negatives, but it's also to some degree uncertainty. And we saw in the previous presentation the degree of uncertainty there is. Now, you brought more of it up to do with the pace of technological change. People find that uncertainty extremely difficult to deal with. They are scared of it. People are naturally risk averse, but they're also what we would call as behavioural scientists ambiguity averse. Technically what we say is a risk is something where you know the odds you're up against. If I've got a 1 in 10 shot, will I take it, will I not? Ambiguity is where you can't even work out the odds you're up against. Yeah. And for a young person now who's looking at the labour market, you've got no idea what the chances you're going to be able to get work in the area that you're choosing are. If you're in a creative industry, is AI really going to touch those really badly or not? We don't know. If you're in an industry where you're primarily looking at traditional cognitive tasks, well, yeah, the chances are probably high. But how high? People really don't know, and the degree of uncertainty is very great. Now, when it comes to people who are in the public system who are planning change, trying to deal with that uncertainty becomes really important. Because as I've already said, people don't like it, and they also latch onto the negatives. So what you have to do is be first and get your positive story out as to why you're doing this and what you're giving people first, and also anticipate what is the negative they're going to be most scared of and address it quickly. What you cannot do is hide and wait for a response, because if you do that, you'll get on the end of the negative story and you'll be in explaining and defensive mode throughout.
Yeah, I mean, I would face this a lot myself in my own work, which is people are like, "Oh, we're sure you would be positive because of whatever," you know. But I'm like, I am a glass half full kind of person, but at the same time, also the future. I mean, I'm called a futurist. It's impossible to be a futurist. None of us know. You know, that future isn't written. It's in the everyday acts that we take to get there. But what I think that people are experiencing at the moment is they don't know where we're going. We don't have a visionary plan. Would you say that that's something that could help, is building out a long-term plan, like with the City Edge project?
Provided it's simple. So what I mean by that is the plan is never going to be simple. How you communicate the plan has to be. So, I mean, we study behavior change. If these plans are designed to change people's behavior, I can tell you that the 3 primary things that matter for people, if I were to summarize the hundreds of thousands of behavioral science papers into the most simple way I can, the things that really matter to people are this. If they see change, they're more likely to support it and they're more likely to change their own behavior. Well, unsurprisingly, if it's cheap, right, if it doesn't cost them, that's not a huge surprise. The other two are in many ways much more interesting, right? If it's fair, and it's communicated as fair. So if the change is there, but they can see that the change is evenly spread, that it's fair, that somebody has thought about making it fair as well, even if it's a bit rough around the edges. So it needs to be cheap, it needs to be fair. And the other thing here that really matters actually is convenience. It needs to be easy, right? So people are disproportionately drawn towards things that they find easy. So where they can see something is easy to do, they're much, much more likely to do it if somebody has made the effort to make it more easy for them. So for example, you can immediately, when you turn up at the building, really simple example, see where to park, see where to put your bicycle, see where the link to the public transport is. These things that make it easy for you, you're much more likely to do. Interestingly, part of the reason for that is social connectedness, because what it's actually telling you is what everybody else is doing. And we feel much more comfortable doing what everyone else is doing. Now, you will know a lot of kind of consultants come up with kind of fancy acronyms and acrostics and things for their plans for change. The problem I have is that when you actually put fair, easy, and cheap into an acronym, you get FEC. And I haven't got anything better than that, but it might make you remember it now. I don't know.
Thank you so much. Andrew, let's talk about the transport dimension of City Edge. I mean, how do we begin planning for a 15-minute city? And I mean, and so part of the rebuttal to this is, yes, but we don't have a conjoined approach for bicycles, trams, cars. You know, it's sort of worked in Ireland before. It works incredibly well in other countries. So how do we lean into that? Is it actually achievable here in Ireland in practice?
Well, I hope it's achievable, yes.
Yeah.
But I think just coming back to your points, I think in relation to taking away somebody's ability to travel, I think the important point here is that you're actually, on the positive side, you're giving somebody choice. And that's when we're designing something like City Edge, that's the really critical point. And that's how we sell it positively. From a transport side, I guess when we're designing something like City Edge, I think there's kind of 3 things that we start to look at. Firstly is to how can we avoid the need to travel? I know that's said in negative, but how can we develop a network which is accessible? And I think the most important point as a transport planner is not so much in the traffic side, is you've really got to be a good land use planner first. So I think when we're designing that 15-minute principle, it's about making sure that we're putting our schools, our shops, our parks, all within an easily walkable distance. So when we look at, in the case of Ireland, around about 25-30% of our trips currently are under 2 kilometres, and yet we still decide that we want to make that journey by car and a lot of the time. So it's about providing that network where we can link these places by safe and attractive walking and cycling networks to do that. In the case of City Edge, again, it's making sure that we're putting a lot of our future development at the right density, the right location around our public transport nodes and hubs. So again, we're investing very much heavily into the Dart Plus, we're heading into the Lewis, we're looking at the Kimmage Lewis as well. So there's a number of systems we're putting in, but it's about making sure that we focus that future development around those hubs. And I think the interesting thing about something like City Edge, which we haven't seen so much in relation to in Ireland, it's that size. It's now getting to that size where we can start to influence future travel patterns and behaviours and influence that future investment in public transport because of the scale of such. So I think it's coming back to your point, I think it's really important, and I think the mayor said it at the time, it's about creating, these aren't just homes, these are communities, that people where they want to live, and I think it's really important we do that. And coming back to your point as well, it's about creating networks as equitable. You said at the beginning there, Peter, about the fact that it's got to be cheap, it's got to be fair, and what's the third point you said there, Peter? Cheap, fair, easy. And that's what City Edge is about, is trying to create a large integrated community, integrated in terms of land use, integrated in terms of transport, so that when people make that choice of how they want to travel, it's their first choice. So ideally what we want to do is we don't want to take away people's choices in the negative, we want to provide them with a choice, but we want that first choice to be, well, actually I can walk to make that trip, or I can cycle to make that trip, or I can make public transport. If I need access to a car, of course I can have access to a car, but it's not my first choice.
I mean, part of some of the challenge possibly is mindset also. I mean, so, you know, one of the things I hear a lot, I'm a cyclist, and one of the things I hear a lot is, oh, but the weather. But in the Netherlands, the weather is equally bad or challenging, let's say. And they have a beautiful expression in Dutch, which is, you're not made of sugar, which is, we could go ahead anyway. You know, how practical is it that people will adopt potentially a healthier lifestyle and move away from their cars?
And that's a really good question. I mean, I was in Copenhagen, as I said to you earlier on, I was in there last autumn, and I went there, and yes, the public transport system's much better. Yes, the walking and cycling network is better. But actually what impressed me most about them, and coming back to Peter's point, is the behavioural piece, is that there's just a collective mindset that we use it. So we are, and certainly in the case of South Dublin, there has been a lot of, you know, investment in walking and cycling recently, which is great. So the infrastructure is going in there. But it's about how do we then start right from schools and everything, the educational piece, how do we get people to encourage them to use that infrastructure? And I do think somewhere like City Edge will come across certain challenges, because City Edge is effectively a brownfield regeneration site at the moment. So we're looking to build communities into areas where there's, you know, industrial areas and so on. So how do we create that environment where people want to walk and cycle and make it safe? But I think we really need to, and we are investing now a lot into that sustainable infrastructure. But I think the bigger piece is that behavioural piece, and that does take time, but it's about that educational piece to try and encourage people to use that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Eoin, I might turn to you now to provide us an overview. I know we've talked about City Edge conceptually from a behavioural part and a planning part. You know, what is your vision for it? And sort of what were the origins? Where has this come from? You know, would have heard me say, you know, we do need cities to grow or towns to become cities. And is it easier to build it from scratch rather than retrofit into something that exists?
There's a couple of advantages to that, I suppose, and I go back to Pete's point. Like, some of it's around that communication piece, and we started out with a strategic framework, which has really helped, I suppose, try to simplify the message, essentially, and we did that back kind of in 2021. So we have that, and now we're trying to bring forward into the detail, which is harder, as Peter was saying. You're starting to explain, and you're trying to start to set rules, but ultimately, if you want to change behaviour, we have to start with the built environment. We have to start with that framework piece, that, and Andrew touched upon a lot, that proximity piece. You talked about that 15-minute city and really trying to challenge the built environment that we're trying to create. And that's what the City Edge plan is trying to do. It's trying to really bring that vibrant mixed-use piece to life. So we haven't really successfully, done that at scale in Ireland to date, where we're getting that new residential and new employment together. Like, and you know, we've heard a brilliant presentation there in relation to Dublin and the role that Dublin has in the Irish economy. City Edge, the current business there, plays a huge part of that. I think it's around 4% of employment in Dublin and 1.9 GVA contribution to the economy. So we need to take that. That's our base. So it's not the greenfield piece. There's a brownfield asset there that we need to bring with us. So that's really important to get that. And that's where the opportunity is, essentially, because it's an established location within the M50 that can bring that, I suppose, that established employment piece, bring mixed use to it. And I think it has probably the best chance of behavioural change of any location in Ireland due to that recognised employment base that's there. But the huge challenge in terms of bringing the built environment to, like, and I take Pete's point about convenience. Like, the big challenge with Ireland at the moment in that high density piece is making compact living attractive. And it comes down to that as an essence point. Like, if I was to take away one thing that we're trying to do, is that make living in high density in this country attractive, and that's bringing it, and layer that up then in City Edge with the employment piece coming with it. So,
I mean, we can see amazing success cases very similar to the plan for City Edge, for example, like in Malmo in Sweden, where it's worked incredibly well, where there's more of a communal mentality, but that's taken a cultural shift. I mean, when we started filming Futureville, I remember talking about shared cars, and people were horrified about sharing their car, yet GoCar works so well for us, you know, the idea of outsourcing. So it does take a little bit of time to catch up. How will we encourage people culturally to trust, to lean into the model?
Absolutely, and I think you know, and Andrew probably could speak to this as well. We've devised City Edge is very different in terms of the behaviour piece that we're trying to influence on the car piece. Like transport is fundamental to the City Edge project, and what we've developed as a concept around the car sharing piece as fundamental, trying to break the link between car ownership and car use, even as an initial stage, where you're trying to get people to, you know, use the car, but true go-car, true car sharing, not outside your door. Maybe it's across the road. Maybe it's in a shared garage that's 400 metres away. And then the pedestrian piece, then the pedestrian environment and the public realm is the trade-off. You get that advantage on the public realm that makes that attractive compact living come to life.
Well, you mentioned parking. Let's go there. 12 spaces available for 200 people here. You know, I mean, look, we need to do better to accommodate what people's lived reality is. Talk to me a little bit about parking barns.
Yeah, and I think that's what I suppose we have it now, that we're doing a study separate to City Edge at the moment, what we're calling the sustainable transport hubs.
Yeah.
So we're trying to, I suppose, we have a policy position, and you mentioned about the car parking, so that's a national policy position, and then we have behaviour, and the two of them are not aligning at the moment, and we're trying to find a middle ground of where we bring forward the parking barns as a kind of a sustainable transport hub. It is that convenience piece that Pete talks about. It is the place where you can easily go and get the car share, you can get the e-scooter, you can rent the bike, and maybe you have an enabler there, a person, a physical piece that makes all that convenient to pay for, to get started, and essentially be an actor in behavioural change, be there to help people along.
I'm going to ask each of the panel one question, which is that, you know, if City Edge is to be a success, what is the most mitigating factor, in your opinion, if this is to work? Peter?
My honest answer to that question is, of course, I don't know. So all I'm really going to do is give you a tip. One of the things we found in our own research about selling change that was really interesting, actually, is where you can link it to the past, it can be really effective. So if you tell people, for example, that you're putting active travel schemes in, and you say to them, you know, people used to walk and cycle in Ireland much more, right? And we're actually going to make it so you can do that again because our cities have become overwhelmed with cars. That actually makes people embrace change more because they can link it to something in their own experience and in their past. So it's not just about a kind of nostalgia either. It's people are less scared of change when they can see that what you're doing is correcting a mistake that's already been made, to allow us to become so overwhelmed that it's unpleasant to walk down our streets because it's so noisy, it's so dirty, and no one else is doing it. You know? And if you can pitch that change as being something that restores something we value, then people are more likely to embrace it.
I think that's excellent, and I would completely agree. That's in line with everything we found with building Futureville out as a concept, that people are constantly referencing back to look forward. And I think that what they want to do is take the best parts of what they had, and there's a fear that that's lost in terms of the life I used to live. We hear it a lot about the way childhood was, for example, and bring that part into the future. So that makes perfect sense. Thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, I'm going to come from a more of a, I suppose, an engineering perspective as my background, but I do think, you know, as Eoin said, we've developed a really strong visionary document, and it sets the direction we want to go. And we do realise this is a 50-year vision of what we need to achieve. But I think for it to be successful, it's got to be beyond just that vision. It's got to be something that we talk about every day, and it's got to be something that we work to. And that requires strong governance, strong leadership to deliver that and to keep promoting that as a positive. I do think as well for it to work, and it is a challenge in Dublin and Ireland, is we do need to deliver on some of that public transport supporting infrastructure as well, and we were trying to do that at the moment. We know at the moment we're looking at Metro, we're looking at Bus Connect, so there's a lot of elements on the table at the moment which we need to deliver. But I do think we need to be, provide that choice for people. And for people to have real choice, they need to be able to have, their public transport offering. But also on the land use side, that we do need to try into, and I know we were speaking to colleagues earlier on, we need to try and make sure that as early as possible, we get our schools in, we get our parks in, we got those places where, so that it feels like a community very early on. And that will be the challenge for City Edge. How do we create that community very early on in the process? But I do think that's it, that early intervention and strong leadership and governance is really how that model works.
Yeah, thank you. And Eoin, give you a magic wand. How will it all work out?
I was just thinking through that, and a lot of that adds up to investment, coordinated investment across the sector, across, and I suppose there's 2 points here. One is we have a vision, we need to last the journey on the vision. So as Pete said, we can't waver a little bit. There's going to be challenges here, there's going to be pushback. We're asking for a whole new typology of building in relation to the mixed use piece and the public realm and the behaviour and the car parking. Like it's a whole kind of, I suppose, transformative piece for the industry to adapt to. So that's going to be tough. But then we also have to find the flexibility. So you're trying to get that unwavering vision with the fundamental points and the principles that we were trying to bring forward. And something that we haven't touched upon here is bringing forward the sustainability piece and the open space that has to come with this. At the moment, it's very much an underutilised industrial area. You have a lot of kind of very sealed, we'll call it, environment in terms of concrete yards and warehouses and stuff. We have to reimagine that, and people need to get public confidence. So we probably need some really I suppose, champion projects to really give public confidence that this is a place I want to invest my money in buying a house, in setting up my business and bring it forward that way. So investment and a coordinated approach is probably the two biggest to get that public confidence going.
And the one thing I would hear the most of is that we suffer from a lack of vision, yet here's a very long-term visionary project. How will you amplify the possibilities of what this could be without it seeming that you're dictating a new way of life?
Yeah, and I suppose it comes back to Pete's piece. It's about the communication of that. I think everybody needs to feel that it's a better quality of life to live here, and we need to be promoting that quality of life, that proximity. People don't want to travel for an hour in their car every day.
Right.
They want to have the proximity of the unbelievable, the sports hub down with the pitches and the club set up. They want all that within walking distance. We just haven't been able to I suppose, do that. We're probably retrofitting a lot, but here we're retrofitting at such scale that there is that opportunity, we feel, to bring all those uses together, get the built environment right as the fundamental to that, get the coordinated investment, and then that will ultimately influence the behavioural change.
Well, if we can make a show about it, let me know.
You're welcome.
But thank you very much to my panel. They've been amazing. Yeah, thank you.